delivering a bolt of force lightning that blasted straight through the stranger into Luke. He felt himself fly backward, consumed by pain, his entire being a column of blue, crackling force flame. The white points at the bottom of Abeloth's eyes flared into nests of blue lightning, which kept growing larger and flashing brighter until they finally spilled out of the sockets to engulf her whole head. Luke hurled another blast of force energy in her direction, then braced himself to take the most devastating counterattack yet. The counterattack never came. Instead, the force blast rocked Abeloth up on one leg, where she hung teetering over the lake of apparitions for 1,000 heartbeats. Luke's chest was a searing ache around a fist-sized scorch hole, and his force essence was bleeding out from a dozen smaller wounds, leaving a crescent of twinkling light spread across the dark water. He sprang anyway. Abeloth only seemed to sag, and it appeared that she might tumble into the water in the eternity it was taking to reach her. But that would have been too easy. Luke and the Sith stranger had been hurling force attacks at her for a lifetime. Or perhaps it was a mere eye blink. And this was the first time she had shown any reaction. Then Luke was there, at Abeloth's side, stomp-kicking her legs, knife-handing her throat, grabbing for her head. It was like cotton striking gauze. No popping ligaments or crunching cartilage. Just force essence pushing into force essence. But the damage was done. Luke's foot went through Abeloth's knee. Her leg buckled. His hand sank into her larynx, and she drew back wheezing. He pivoted around behind her, swinging one arm around her shoulder and grabbing for her chin, slipping the other arm up under hers and pressing his wrist into her neck. But grappling was different beyond shadows. There were no pressure points or joint locks or chokeholds, only his presence merging with hers, binding him to her in a writhing knot of energy. Tentacles began to lash at his face, probing for his nose and ears and mouth. A pair of gray tips shot into view, blurring and growing large. Luke closed both eyes and turned away, but not quickly enough. The right eye socket exploded in pain, and everything went dark on that side of his head. The tattooed stranger stepped in from the left, then slid to the front and drove his stiffened fingers deep into the pit of Abeloth's stomach. A black spray erupted from the wound, and she writhed in pain as the stranger probed for something to grab. Abeloth loosed a force blast, trying to drive the stranger off. He held tight. So did Luke, and all three went tumbling across the lake in a snarled mass of limbs and tentacles. Then Luke felt an icy twinge between his shoulder blades. The twinge became a sting, and he began to feel something cold flowing down the center of his back. His first thought was Abeloth, that she had sunken a tentacle into his spine, until the lashing of her tentacles slowed, and she began to shudder. Luke did not understand until an eternity later, when the stranger rolled up on his feet and jerked them all to a halt. The Sith seemed to be growing stronger as Abeloth grew weaker, and there were wisps of dark fumes swirling off his shoulders and head. It did not take a Jedi Grand Master to understand that Luke was being betrayed by a force-draining technique. Still holding Abeloth tight, Luke shifted his hips, rolling them both onto their sides, and kicked a foot through the stranger's knee. The joint buckled, and the Sith dropped onto the surface of the dark water, still on the opposite side of Abeloth from Luke. "I'll release her," Luke warned.
Abeloth?
The stranger shook his head.
Never.
Despite the Sith's words, the cold stinging inside began to subside, and Luke realized the stranger was not pulling as hard. Abeloth continued to struggle, slipping a pair of tentacles around Luke's throat and trying to tear herself free. But she was growing weak faster than Luke. The draining seemed to continue for days. Then the stranger threw back his head and screamed in anguish, and it suddenly seemed that only a breath had passed. Shiny black force energy began to pour from the Sith's wounds into the lake, spreading outward around them in an oily slick so hot the water began to steam and hiss. Still, the stranger continued to drain Abeloth, and Luke realized that he was not being betrayed. The Sith was suffering as much damage from the attack as was Luke. Abeloth whipped her chin free of Luke's hand, ripping the energy knot where they had joined and sending a sparkling line of both of their force essences splattering across the surface of the lake. She began to roll her head around, gnashing and spitting, trying to sink her fangs into Luke's arm or the stranger's, anything she could reach. Luke slipped his arm down around her throat and pulled hard, merging his form into hers, doing his best to keep her under control. "Keep going," Luke urged the stranger. "Pull harder!" Abeloth lay tangled in Luke's arms, a writhing mass of force energy that had suddenly gone limp a second or a day ago, only to explode an hour or a nanosecond later into a flailing tempest that had sent them all rolling and bouncing across the Lake of Apparition's dark waters. The stranger was tumbling with them, his hand still buried in Abeloth's chest, now wailing in agony as gleaming black force energy steamed from his wounds. They bounced so close to the shore, Luke grew worried that Abeloth was trying to carry them away from the lake into some new place beyond shadows. And then what? His back hit the water again, and he spun them all around so that his feet were toward the shore. He planted his feet against a moss hummock and kicked off and sent them all somersaulting back toward the center of the lake. Abeloth stopped struggling and seemed to shrink in his arms, and Luke dared to think that maybe, just maybe, she had finally lost hope, that they had exhausted her to the point that she was no longer capable of fighting. Then she was gone, leaving the stranger and Luke with nothing between them but 20 centimeters of space and the stump of the Sith's hand, now pointed at Luke's chest and still drawing force energy, draining it not from Abeloth now, but directly from Luke. They stayed like that for an eternity, a void of cold nothingness growing inside Luke as the stranger continued to hang in the air above, draining him. It seemed to Luke that the Sith's betrayal was premature, that they at least ought to make certain Abeloth was truly dead before they turned to fighting each other. But that was not the way Sith did things. Luke started to bring his hand up, intending to hit the stranger with a force blast, but before he could loose it, the Sith's feet dropped to the water's surface, and he raised his stump and pointed toward the far end of the lake.
There!
Luke craned his neck and saw Abeloth's silhouette backing into the mists of forgetfulness, with the stranger's wrist still protruding from her chest. "Stop her!" Luke yelled. "If she disappears into that fog—" Luke left the sentence unfinished as a fountain of oily black force energy erupted from the protruding wrist. Abeloth's mouth gaped open, and her piercing shriek broke over the lake, reverberating across the water like a clap of thunder. Luke glanced over and saw the stranger standing beside him, pointing in her direction, using the force to draw his missing hand back toward its stump. Abeloth did not come dancing in to counterattack, did not even try to stand off defensively and weaken them with a blast of force lightning. She did not have time for such tactics. Luke doubted she would have fled the battle in the first place if she were not already dying, and with her force essence gushing out of her like a geyser, she had to attack now. And she did. In the next thought, Abeloth was simply there in front of the stranger, driving a ball of tentacles deep into him. Luke sprang forward to help and felt a blistering iciness slide deep into his own chest. His entire right side flared into cold anguish, and the tentacles began to dig and grab, tearing him apart inside in a way no lightsaber or blaster ever could. Luke attacked anyway, driving an elbow strike into the side of her head. As before, there was no crunching, no physical sense of impact, only force energy plowing through force energy, sending waves of pain and damage rolling through them both. Luke sensed his elbow come free as it pushed out the other side of Abeloth's head. Then she simply fell away, her still balled tentacles tearing free of both Luke and the stranger, each clutching a handful of dripping, pulsing force essence. The stranger collapsed with a gaping hole in his chest. Luke felt his own form grow limp and weak, and he sensed his mouth falling open to scream. Then his whole body was falling, weak and aching for breath.